Bob, I'm so glad we had the opportunity to sit down today. There is so much to discuss, given the environment we're in. Some good, some challenging. So let's get to it. First of all, let's start with a broad overview. How would you describe the performance of PwC over the last year?
Yeah, so thanks for doing this, first of all. I would describe the performance of PwC this past year as really good, but in the context of a pretty interesting environment externally. The headline news will be that we've had top-line growth, US dollar equivalent of 10% year over year, which is great as you look at that external environment. Local currency, 7%. But I go back to what we made as a statement 2 years ago. We said we didn't want to be the biggest. We wanted to be the best and most relevant and valuable brand in the professional services space. So while we have grown significantly, I'm probably more proud of the fact that we've repositioned the portfolio and the competencies. We've invested in our people quite a bit to get them fit for purpose going forward. And we've invested and given back to the communities in which we operate, live, and work. And that is important, I think, as we think about the business community and the role that it plays in society.
When you're talking about repositioning and sort of, pivoting to the future, so what is driving growth?
So 3 things. One is that the client demand is there. Today's CEO, management team, boards, government officials struggle with how do I keep pace. So I need the expertise, I need the best practices as I continue to transform my organizations. And as we've articulated, we want to be in strategy through execution. So not is it only about the strategy and how you execute, but everything around that. And trust becomes really important, hence the reason why our assurance business is so important and relevant to the capital markets, for example. So that's one piece. The second piece is we've been able to get the right people at the right place at the right time. So this is about building out the competencies. Here, I would say CEOs, management teams struggle with the technology and digital agenda. So having the right capabilities in that space while doing all the stuff we've used to do is really important. So that's why the transformation of PwC is equal as important to serving those that are transforming themselves as well.
That technology aspect is so important. I want to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But where would you like to see improvement, though?
So the improvement for us has got to come in a couple of key areas that are important to the future. And it's not so much as improvement as it is probably more focus, more attention, and time. So I'd say in the area of cyber, big important problem in terms of what the world is dealing with, and goes right at that heart of trust with the digital agenda. You can look at our focus in the private area. Private, in the spirit of the capital markets, is becoming much more important as you look at the public versus private marketplace right now. The influence of the sovereign wealth funds, the private equity organizations, billionaires' money to have influence on business and society is huge. And then continuing to roll out our competencies more consistently around the world, particularly in the emerging markets, follow the demographic shifts.
Yeah.
Where we are today in Asia is going to change dramatically in the next 10 years. Middle East, Africa over the next 20 plus. So that's important for us in terms of getting the right people, right place, right time, and right scale and consistency across. And the last thing I would say is making sure that we continually improve on the quality of the services that we are delivering, regardless of what that service may be.
What does PwC mean? What does that brand mean?
So that brand to me is all about what our purpose is. So our role, our responsibility, our obligation to society, for lack of a better word, is to build trust in society and help solve some really important problems. And organizations, community leaders, government officials should be able to trust us because we have the quality of services and the knowledge in our people's heads and in the data that we have available to ourselves that we can deliver on a consistent basis no matter where we are around the world. We are trusted. You are either trusted to provide a level of assurance over information or data, whatever is important, and that's not necessarily just financial statements. It could be around controls, it could be around project management, whatever. And if in fact you've got a challenge, we have the right resources that can come and solve that and actually think holistically around the issues there. So that's to me where PwC is really relevant and valuable to society, not just to the clients that we're interacting with, which causes us to make sure that we're focused equally on the societal piece as we are the business piece. And that's where our community leaders are equally as important to us as a stakeholder as the business community leaders are. And that's where we've got to be thinking, just like we advise our clients, to think holistically about the role that business plays in society today.
And so how do you do that? How do you stay relevant? We are in a digital big data environment. So how is that changing?
So 2 or 3 things that are really driving our change, because we have to disrupt ourselves and transform ourselves. So we are in the process of actually a major investment in our people. I talked about one of those things this past year. upskilling our people to be more relevant and knowledgeable about digital technologies and the like is a huge undertaking for us, but it's going to pay back long-term dividends. Second is the type of people we're bringing into the organization has changed a lot. So if you step back and look at the number of recruits we take off of campus, which is 27,000 a year, the reality is they're not just finance majors and tax professionals, they're STEM now. They're scientists, technologists, engineers, mathematics, and the like. And then last but not least is the direct hiring that we're doing, and if necessary, alliances and partnerships with other organizations to bring those relevant skill sets in, that this way we can actually deliver against the needs of our clientele. So
This
those
has
are
to
the
be a vastly different
We're
environment than you would have faced even 5 years ago.
We're doing things that we never would have thought of 2 years ago. How do you leverage data so I can maybe eventually start to figure out ways to predict where a possibility for fraud is going to be? How do I actually embed in a supply chain enough information so I actually can talk about the security of the food supply chain and where it's originally sourced for, and leveraging blockchain technology? How authentic is that? So those are the things that we're doing today, and our people, they've got the skills to be creative and innovative. Our job is to make sure we are equipping them with the ability to do so we can disrupt ourselves in terms of our existing services, but also then think about new and different things that, again, the clientele, governments, business community, and our communities want and need. So our theme is really focused around a couple of things. One is, what's the organizational purpose in terms of remaining relevant to that external environment, and what's our role in society? Second, what kind of values do we actually espouse? And therefore, what's the culture of the place? And is that a talent magnet, an additional way to bring people into this place and allow them to perform, survive, and thrive, more importantly, regardless of what their personal professional objectives may be? And the more we can focus on the individual, the more likely to stay and contribute at the right pace and time.
Let's talk about diversity. There's been an embrace of companies wanting to close I don't think there's anybody who says we don't want to close the gender gap. We want more women in executive roles. But when you look at the industry and you look at your company, it's not where it needs to be, right? 16% of women lead audits. How do you change that? How do you take a commitment in theory and make it actionable?
We've spoken a lot about this in the past, and we're actioning it today. This is about people making conscious decisions to get people the experience, the exposure, and give them the opportunity, most importantly. What I'm thrilled with this past year is you look at our partnership group around the world, our new partners, 30% of our new partners were women this year. It's a record number, and we're up almost double in the percentage, not in the numbers, the percentage when you look back as short as about 10 years ago. So that's a great amount of improvement. And now the question is, how do we continue to do that with our leaders around the world and continue to get them those experiences and exposure and put them in place to be successful? Because we have usually talented women that can do the things that we're asking them to do, and we have evidence that they've done that.
Do you feel more pressure to take a stance on social issues?
You have to. The reality is today, any CEO, management team, or board is much more so in the limelight around the societal issues. Why? Either because their employees expect that, their customers expect that, their broader stakeholders expect that. And if you're silent on some of these issues or seen as not contributing, you're now part of the problem. So it's important, I think, as you look at leadership responsibilities around the world, it's not just those in elected or appointed positions in government. It is very much the business community. And we see more businesses spending more time in that space, and candidly, the expectation is high on us to do exactly the same. So we're spending time around the issues of education. We're contributing to the issues around refugees and immigration. We're spending time thinking about, how do I get in India clean water to the right place? Or in Africa to get chartered schools started up to figure out what's going on? Or even in the US here, where our US leadership team is focused on diversity and getting the business community engaged in that with our CEO in Action activities, that's where we've got to play a role. And that's important to our overall brand and our long-term sustainability.
You mentioned the issue of trust before. I want to read you something that I read in the UK press, and I'm quoting here. The big four are too dominant, audit quality is too low, and the wider industry is too conflicted. It's pretty scathing. Let's break it down a little bit and start with what I think is the most serious issue in that laundry list, and that's conflict of interest. This isn't new, but with revenue increasing on the consulting side exponentially compared to audit, how can you adequately audit a company when you're also selling them services?
So let's make sure we got some facts on the table first. Today, we have the responsibility in various countries around the world to audit, and there's rules and regulations of what we can't do. And we comply with those rules and regulations. As you look at the services we are providing, they are adjacent to the audit. So we may be doing some tax work from a compliance perspective. We may be doing some diligence relevant to what may be done at a client that's going through an M&A activity. And those things actually allow for us to deliver better quality in terms of what needs to be done. And if you look at the stats, the amount of other work we're doing is very small. The challenge in conflict of interest is actually a couple-fold. First off, you have an issue today where conflicts are being, I'll call it, measured and determined by the moral compass, not the regulatory compass. So we've actually got to work together to actually change the regulations to deal with what I'll call the public perception versus the reality. So that's the first issue.
What is the difference between the public perception and the reality?
So today the public expects us to do only this, whereas the management teams want us to do a bunch of other things, and the rules that have been previously determined by regulators have said you can do X, Y, and Z. So there's definitely a change in the public perception versus where we have been in the historical rules right now. So that's a big challenge as we think about what should be looked at. And again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. Society has a bigger voice right now in the world and what we're living in, and therefore the question is, how do we react to that? So therefore the profession has to think carefully, working with all the other stakeholders to say, should the rules, regulations be changed around conflicts, expectation gaps, and things of that nature?
And some would say yes, and the way to address that is to break them up. Separate out consultancy from the audit process.
Doesn't solve the problem. In fact, I'm going to argue it creates more problems.
How so?
So if you step back and think about the benefits of some of the skills and competencies that we have in an organization like ours, they are additive to a quality audit, first off. It allows for diversification of our portfolio to allow for investments in quality to make sure we're doing a good quality job and able to recruit the talent that we need necessarily to do this. The audit today of a bank or a technology company or an organization that is leveraging blockchain requires a huge amount of expertise. And in fact, if you don't have that expertise because all you have is a bunch of people that understand the numbers, we miss the bigger risks. And those risks include the risks of, are they actually doing the right things? The risks of how, in fact, is this company able to perform at the level they do and report the way they do? And two of these things coincide. So that becomes extremely important. The second thing that's a challenge right now is I think we have missed the secondary effect of this mandatory firm rotation around the world. Mandatory firm rotation requires us to change auditors every so often. Well, if an organization actually does say, I'm going to keep clean, but then actually says 5 years later, I'm going to be your auditor, I don't have any history, I might not even have the knowledge of that industry to do a quality job. So that's a challenge in of itself as well. And on top of that, in mandatory firm rotation, some of the firms or the management teams have decided not to do the work, which limits choice. And that's another challenge right now, because when you look at all these things, it's too easy to simplify it. You have an issue of audit quality, expectation gap, conflicts, as well as do we have sufficient choice in the marketplace to do what we need to do. So I'd like to see us as a profession, and more importantly the capital markets, actually step back and say, can we look at everything and say, what's the problem we really want to solve for? And let's make sure we don't rush to what is maybe a great headline news answer, because that's got downstream and secondary effects that could be even more negative than what we have today.
Where do we start the conversation? What would be the right framework?
I think you have to start with the first issue, which is for the work that we are being hired to do, let's make sure we do a good job.
So there is room for improvement on the audit side.
Absolutely, there is room for improvement. And we disclose our quality results, our internal inspection quality results. And we've had improvement this year compared to last year, which is great, but it's still not good enough.
Is it hard to keep the long game in focus when we are so short-term driven these days, so short-sighted with the push of technology?
So the answer is yes, and I think that's one of the reasons why private enterprises actually are more important in the world order today. They're able to take that long-term effect, or long-term view rather, and not be so subject to the scrutiny of short-term results or short-term elections or whatever stakeholder group you want to talk to. But this is where leadership comes into play here. Leaders have got to be more equipped in terms of doing the right things, not necessarily to solve for the 2% that turns you from a minority to majority, get a vote and get elected, or the demographic shift in an organization that says, okay, my populism inside the organization is good. You got to deal with the tough stuff, and you got to be willing to take a stand. Our CEO survey around the world would tell us, if you look back over the last 5 years, CEOs and business leaders and even government officials have many more stakeholders today than ever before. And the speed at which those stakeholders are engaging or want to engage or can engage faster than ever before. And the divergence amongst those stakeholders is wider than ever before, which requires then CEOs, management teams, and others to do a much better job of thinking about what's right, picking your battles, and then talking about not only what you're doing, but why you're doing it. And you've got to be able to try to explain the rationale behind it, because if you're just going to talk about the what, you're going to get too much scrutiny right now. So it requires a different style of leadership and a different social responsibility as you look ahead in terms of how to actually deal with the masses and the complexities around that.
It was such a pleasure to be able to sit down with you today. Appreciate
Absolutely.
it.
Thanks for doing this.